feel the effects of the agent?
Everything's moving.
They had no idea what the drug was going to do to us. They just moved the monkey out of the way and put me in there behind him.
They hammered it into us. You cannot tell anybody about what you saw or what you went through, including your family.
This is Cold War, and that's when I was assigned. Cold War was at its height. The mission at Edgewood was to find a drug that would produce incapacitation to decrease the enemy's ability to perform without killing them.
Where are you, David? You know where you are? Can you say anything, David?
Ketchum didn't believe anyone got hurt. He went to his deathbed saying the same thing.
Yep.
That it was a lie.
I have hallucinations almost every night.
Feel it. Reaper!
And it's gone on since Edgewood.
The excerpts you have seen were intended to demonstrate...
I've got regrets about a number of things I've done. That would not apply to the work I did at Edgewood. I thought I did a pretty good job with that.
Participants received the incapacitating agent by inhalation. A low dose of agent was fed into the mixing bowl.
This is a story of one of the darkest and most bizarre chapters of recent history.
Borderline hallucinations will come late in the experiment.
One that the US government and military would rather not be told. For 2 decades, secret human experiments were performed on our own soldiers, with the goal to weaponize mind-altering drugs. But what's most shocking is that the soldiers involved in these experiments believe the military is covering up what really happened at Edgewood Arsenal.
The whole thing is just so criminal that they did to their own soldiers, that somebody needs to be held accountable.
As an investigative journalist and a former White House correspondent, I have seen corruption and cover-ups at the highest levels. And I've always tried to bring accountability to our government through my reporting. To see just how deep the rabbit hole goes, I've assembled a team, including fellow investigative journalists Jasper Craven and Lorraine Boissonneau, government archival researchers Kai Baylor and Rick Ramirez, and chemical warfare historian Reed Kirby. Our investigation will take a 360-degree approach. We'll trace the 20-year timeline of the Edgewood experiments through once highly classified documents and films,
Experiencing hallucinations
and take a deep dive into the human trials of these potent chemical agents through the first-hand accounts from the test subjects themselves.
No one, and I mean no one, have I ever talked to about this.
But the key that may unlock Edgewood's most closely guarded secrets comes from the mastermind of the program itself, Dr. James Ketchum. Through an exclusive, never-before-seen interview recorded just before his death, we'll piece together what really happened at Edgewood and pressure test the soldiers' claim that it wasn't just the Army who was experimenting on them, that darker forces were at play, which the government has been covering up for decades.
At least 8 Nazi scientists were at Edgewood. These were Hitler's favorite chemists in Nazi Germany.
And the CIA was involved. They were actually used to experiment on us, trying to brainwash people, which the CIA was interested in. But all the records were destroyed, and who knows whether they're still doing it or not.
You don't condone that, do you?
Destruction of records?
Yes.
Not generally.
You may have heard of Edgewood, but you've never heard the story like this. Edgewood Arsenal has been America's research center for chemical warfare for over a century. Here, scientists developed, manufactured, and tested some of the most lethal chemical agents the world has ever known. But after World War II, Edgewood Arsenal began research into new types of non-lethal agents.
Around 1951, the Army Chemical Center at Edgewood had a crash program to develop an incapacitating psychochemical that would have temporary paralysis without killing an enemy soldier. But at the same time, there was a revolution in pharmacology for treating psychiatric disorders. Because of that, the Army Chemical Center got involved in seeing if the ill effects of those drugs, the side effects that make pharmaceuticals unsuitable, might make them useful as a weapon.
In its search for incapacitating agents, the chemical warfare laboratories are investigating a great many chemical compounds.
There's something in here. They're looking at a survey of different compounds, so things that produce anxiety, hallucinations, and psychoses.
Correct. So they tested as many different chemicals as they could with animals to see which ones were most effective and promising candidates.
In laboratory experiments, a normal cat displays the typical hunter instinct toward a mouse. A minute quantity of lysergic acid diethylamide is administered in aerosol form.
Over 250 different drugs and chemical compounds were tested at Edgewood. But the hallucinogenic effects of lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD, showed the greatest potential in the search for an ideal incapacitating agent.
The effects of the psychochemical become apparent. The cat is no longer interested in catching the mouse, and in fact appears to be afraid of it.
So I'm guessing that having to test on humans is partly because you need to know what the experience is like in a human brain, and that's not really something an animal can convey.
Absolutely. Like, animal testing would be the lead up to that point, and then when you have something you think is a solid candidate, then you'd want to do human testing to confirm that it would be a usable weapon.
I was a young, naive soldier straight out of the tobacco fields of North Carolina. I saw flyers about going on this temporary duty project.
It was for medical research volunteers.
Take your seats, men.
They had a program at our theater on the base, and I went to see what it was about.
The guy got up and gave us a talk, said, "You're going to be testing Army equipment. You know, at the other volunteer bases, testing gas mask, boots, or clothing."
And a whole bunch of good stuff on it about, you know, no KP, no guard duty, and every weekend off. And I said, "Oh, boy, that sounds really good." I said, "I'll volunteer for that."
I was selected. I got a letter to report to Edgewood, Maryland. When I got there, it didn't have the appearance of a military base whatsoever. I really felt good about it. I said, well, this is gonna be nice. I'll be here 2 months, and I don't have nothing to do, just go to do some testing of equipment. That was initially what we were told.
We got there, they said there's been a slight program change.
On behalf of the commanding officer and his staff,
We're gonna have a group of you
there's no need to be alarmed at the presence of these cameras.
not test weapons. We're gonna test other non-lethal combatant materials. So we said, fine, we're here, we might as well do it.
And they took a picture of our group. 55 of us were there for 60 days. The average days we had a a formation in the morning. We would go and eat breakfast. There was a day room, and it had a pool table, books, magazines, games, you know. And then there was a bulletin board, and if you were assigned to an experiment, then, you know, your name was there and it told you where to report.
But we never knew what kind of tests we were going to do.
We went where the military wanted us to go, and if we volunteered, we did what we were told, period, no questions asked.
I believe at that time, my government wouldn't lie to me. I was wrong.
We were guinea pigs. For my experiment, they had a long metal duct, just like an air conditioning duct. And at that end was a fan, which you could see. And I wore a gas mask with a tube running over to an oscilloscope. It was LSD. It didn't take long that I began to feel the effects. I remember this as clear as could be. All I heard, the doctors that were standing around, turn it off, turn it off, turn it off, because I was taking too much.
Medical research.
Okay.
I'm sorry, Doc. Come on, baby.
That's all right, Captain.
All right.
How do you feel?
Feel like you're asking me now? I mean,
Yeah.
it's all over.
How do you feel right now?
Can't figure it out.
It's hard to figure out.
It's hard to figure. I
Okay.
see it. I don't believe it. I feel it.
Do you know
Reaper!
Do you know what day it is today, Cap?
Yeah.
What?
I wasn't 100% out of it, but I couldn't think of what day it is.
How can you study anyway?
Remember I said they yelled, "Stop it, stop it, stop it"? I found out the dosage was unknown.
I feel like I'm going back so far, so many faces, and the basic of the rooted cause. What day is it? I can't remember a thing. I can't remember. Come on, man. I don't want this stuff. Get off of it. Can't remember a thing.
The difficulty remembering is not really amnesia as much as it is difficulty concentrating. LSD...
I can't swear that Dr. Ketchum was there, but it was known who was the boss.
In 1962, Dr. James Ketchum, an Army psychiatrist, was assigned to Edgewood Arsenal as research director to spearhead the human testing of psychochemicals.
Can you count backwards from 10 down to 1? Go ahead, count backwards.
12, 11, Jack. Oh, wait a minute. 4 clean. Jack 10.
Ketchum was a staunch believer that delirium-inducing drugs could be effective weapons on the battlefield. But like many in the military at the time, he was caught up in Cold War paranoia. The threat that Russia's own psychochemical program was outpacing America's may have pushed him and his fellow researchers at Edgewood to violate medical ethics and disregard potential dangers these experimental drugs had on the volunteer soldiers. All in the name of national security.
We feared the Russians would develop chemical agents and weapons. We felt the Russians were way ahead of us in chemical warfare development. They weren't. They tended to exaggerate, perhaps, or we tended to exaggerate some more. This is Cold War, and that's when I was assigned. Cold War was at its height.
Ketchum died in 2019, but he left behind a personal record of the research he conducted at Edgewood in a final interview that has never been seen until now.
We did start out with it primarily as a method of defense and protection, and then subsequently, can we develop anything ourselves that we might use that wouldn't be harmful.
And that's how I got involved, was the non-lethal weapons concept.
You feel the effects of the agent?
Yes, I do.
Are they quite strong, would you say, or mild?
I don't know, just like in two different worlds.
Are the effects increasing or staying the same? Or decreasing?
I don't know, they just come and go.
Are they stronger now than they were half an hour ago?
The soldiers who volunteered for the Edgewood assignment believe they were lied to.
I don't know, I think they are.
Or misinformed of the nature of the experiments that they signed up for.
And then continue subtracting.
They claim they were never told of the adverse or possible long-term effects the drugs would have on them.
7 from 98.
But in Ketchum's mind, the testing he conducted fell in line with standard operating procedures of a classified program.
We gave them all the information we could. We couldn't give them the name of the agent because that was a military secret.
7 from 98.
Everything's moving.
I know it's difficult, but try it.
And we couldn't predict all of the effects to the subjects because those would vary. So I believe we were as transparent as we could be.
92.
Under the circumstances.
92. All right, what's next then?
I don't know.
What comes after 92? Can you subtract 7 from 92? Try, take 7 from 92.
7 from 92?
In mild form, visual changes are apparent only in the peripheral field of vision. But as the intensity increases, the central part of the field is involved as well. How would you gauge the severity of LSD effect in this subject?
I want you to subtract 7 from 101.
It seems like Ketchum's in there for these evaluations, I presume, right?
Oh yeah, he personally participated in the research directly. It was up to Jim Ketchum whether or not they had had enough to be withdrawn from the test.
Okay, that's enough right now. Dale, thank you very much. You can go on back.
That's why you see him in every one of these movies.
LSD does not produce a dreamy relaxation. Rather, it is a powerful
There are
stimulant.
actually 10 rules of conduct that all researchers must abide by when performing human experiments. It's called the Nuremberg Code. It's a set of rules that were established after World War II in response to the medical atrocities performed by Nazi scientists.
On the 8th of August, 1945.
When I first heard the story of Edgewood, it hit home. My own grandmother was experimented on by Nazi scientists in a camp in Hamburg, Germany during World War II. Because of her account and thousands more like hers, these 10 rules are recognized today under international law. One rule states, voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. This means that the volunteers must be properly informed of the nature and possible outcome of the experiment. But under Ketchum, the volunteers weren't told what drugs they were given or what the possible side effects would be. Another rule of the Nuremberg Code states, during the course of the experiment, the scientist in charge must be prepared to terminate the experiment at any stage if he believes that a continuation of the experiment is likely to result in injury, disability, or death to the experimental subject. But did the experiments actually cause harm? The soldiers who participated in the tests believe they did. Edgewood's human research was a highly classified program. The volunteers were all under a strict secrecy oath for more than 50 years after the program ended. They were forbidden from speaking about anything that went on within that facility. Today, they're still seeking answers as to what the Army did to them and why no one has been held accountable.
They promised not to harm us. The consent stated that you knew and had been explained what would happen to you, which was a lie. It was an out blatant lie. They didn't even know what would happen to you. And you signed a disclaimer saying that you knew what they were giving you, even though you didn't.
Ketchum was as bad as the rest of them. And he didn't believe anyone got hurt.
Right, oh yeah.
He went to his deathbed saying the same thing.
Yeah.
And that it was a lie.
They gave him accommodations and awards. What do we get? All we get is kicked to the curb and try to prove that we have problems from these tests from 50 years prior. The whole thing is just so criminal that they did to their own soldiers, that somebody needs to be held accountable.
It should be obvious from these excerpts that LSD is indeed a potent drug.
Were Ketchum and the Edgewood researchers violating medical ethics? Or was the human research they conducted sound and necessary science in the name of national security? This is the central question of our investigation, and there's only one man who can answer that.
People said, we were putting them through terrible experiences that were really unjust and immoral. And most of the people who were delirious didn't remember any of their delirious behaviors. Same as if you had a dream. I don't think drug studies were in those that they had in mind when the Nuremberg rules were first put together. Namely, that the experimenter should be willing to stop any experiment if it appeared to him that it was harmful or causing problems. But to give a drug that lasts 3 days, and the guy's going to say on day 2, I want to stop this experiment. I don't like the way I feel. You really couldn't do it. You'd have to wait for it to wear off.
What is coming next?
I feel incapacitated.
Incapacitated, well, I'll ask you more about that in a minute, but just try to subtract these sevens for me.
Though Ketchum believed the Nuremberg Code didn't apply to the psychochemical research at Edgewood, the U.S. Army was assured that it would be shielded from any repercussions or future lawsuits from the test subjects by what's called the Ferris Doctrine. It's a 1950s Supreme Court ruling that prohibits soldiers from taking any kind of legal action against the military.
Essentially, what the court ruled was that the military could subject its people to all sorts of mistreatment, up into including death, and enjoy broad immunity for all of that behavior. This allowed the military secretive human testing to thrive.
So they basically opened Pandora's box, and now they could perform all of these experiments on servicemen and get away with it.
Yes, carte blanche. They could do whatever they wanted.
Ketchum not only believed psychochemicals could be weaponized against our enemies, he saw the potential in them for a more humane approach to warfare and set out to find the ideal non-lethal agent.
This man, an experienced infantry sergeant, volunteered to receive a test dose of an anticholinergic compound. Within 2 to 3 hours...
The mission at Edgewood when I arrived was to find a drug that would produce incapacitation. To me, that's a big improvement over having to go in and shoot everyone. Marijuana had been used first in trials, which would produce a state of, being slightly woozy or whatever.
Do you find the sensation unpleasant?
No, great.
You like it?
Very much.
Right?
Yeah.
How do you feel?
PCP is another one that just had momentary use, you might say.
I feel pretty good, sir.
Do you? Are you cold?
No, I'm not cold at all.
And then was discarded as too dangerous in terms of its effects on behavior.
Yes, sir. I run 100 miles right now.
Is that right?
That's right.
Pretty pepped up, huh?
Uh-huh.
So the idea of developing a non-lethal agent started out with LSD. LSD didn't cause the total inability to function, even though it's totally confused behavior. That's an interesting aspect of LSD. If the pressure is there to perform, many individuals can perform if they need to, and they have to, pull themselves together.
Jesus Christ.
What are you doing that for?
I came in really when BZ came on the scene. BZ is more active and longer lasting than LSD. It blocks acetylcholine, which is the principal drug that controls behavior.
Within 2 to 3 hours, he shows all the features of a toxic delirium, which can produce psychosis lasting several days.
At the typical incapacitating dose, BZ caused a real kaleidoscope of effects, scattered function and thinking and alteration in perception that is prominent in delirium. BZ was the chemical of choice, and I built the program around that.
6.5 hours after exposure time, the confused volunteer needed help as he attempted to traverse part of an obstacle course. At this point, hallucinations and other mental disturbances were evident.
We had millions of dollars to work with, and also a systematic recruiting of volunteers, so we were able to put together a rather elaborate series of testing. The program would be announced, and out of maybe 300 subjects, 20 would be chosen for the higher dose, more intense form of drug effect.
Subtract 7 again.
7 for 91 is...
In the sequences that follow, delirium was produced experimentally by the administration of various belladonna alkaloids. Delirium may be viewed as a form of brain failure.
I'll kill him.
Neurons misfire, synapses are blocked, inhibitory influences are improperly modulated, and so forth.
7. Are they fingerprint with 7?
So the discovery of BZ was actually the discovery of the ideal incapacitating agent at Edgewood.
Yeah, it seemed like this really checked a lot of the boxes in what they were looking for. It incapacitated people, it had long-lasting effects. I mean, this really was the ideal weapon in a way.
Are there any street drugs that are similar to BZ?
No. BZ's a bad trip. It's something that's more like psychosis or delirium. BZ was the one drug that was still nerve agent potent, but it also had effects that lasted way longer than LSD, were more consistent in incapacitation. It's a bad thing. People would not recreationally choose to take it. BZ produced delirium, which is not the same as hallucinating like you would with LSD. It's a nightmare experience.
Here is an illustration of its use in a volunteer subject.
How do you feel, David?
First, a sample of his pretest mental status.
They were always coming to me to say, "Hey, come on, we're doing another one, we're doing another one." In my case, I think I spent 3 times in the padded rooms.
The subject was given a delirium-producing dose of atropine and is interviewed at the height of the drug action.
What post are you stationed at, David? What post are you stationed at?
We all did different tests. And some of them were put in padded rooms, which I was not. I was in like a clinical type setting with 6 or 8 other guys. They said, sit down here, and I lean over and breathe into this machine. Still, I didn't know what to expect. They never explained nothing to me.
How old are you, David? David, how old are you? David, how old are you? Where are you, David? You know where you are? Can you say anything, David?
I don't know how long the hallucination lasted.
How do you feel? Tell us how you feel, David.
Probably 2 or 3 days. There wasn't much left of me by the time they got done with me.
Sit there a second or two. They said, okay, let's go back to the dispensary. And at some point, in my skin, under my skin, my freckles, I was seeing bugs. I thought they were actually bugs. They were crawling under my skin. I got up and I went in the bathroom and I had my razor, and I actually tried to cut the bugs out from under. Well, I was seeing on my arm, but they tried to cut one off my leg. And I didn't tell them because I didn't want them to know that I had bugs crawling under my skin. And I told them I'd dropped my razor, which indeed, that wasn't the truth. And that's all documented in the notes that I got from them. At the end of the test, they always do a little write-up. And they said, no untoward effects noticed, even though I was given an above the normal incapacitating amount that should have done the job. In other words, they gradually increased the amount of drugs, kept increasing them till you got to what they called a man break point, which is where you totally go completely out of it. But that was their intention, was to harm
you. He was just lucky to get out alive.
Are you in danger here, you think?
I feel that I am, sir.
What's the danger here?
And I just don't feel that I am safe here in the house.
Here in this...
Here in this house, anyways.
You don't feel safe here?
No, I don't, sir.
Mm-hmm.
It's obvious from these videos that BZ was successful at incapacitation. But what's also clear is that many of the test subjects suffered as a result of being exposed to it. Nuremberg Rule Number 4 states, the experiment should be conducted so as to avoid all unnecessary physical and mental suffering and injury. Was it really necessary to subject our own soldiers to physical and mental suffering in the name of national security? Apparently Ketchum thought so. And so did the Army's top brass, who gave him the money to advance the program into the next phase. Mock combat scenarios.
This is Private First Class Zadrozny, normally an efficient, well-trained soldier. 2 years with Army intelligence, but now as a volunteer test subject under the influence of a standard incapacitating chemical agent, his training is worthless.
The military are not going to be very interested in strictly laboratory-oriented testing. We've got to show them something about how they would perform in a military-type situation.
This film report covers a 72-hour clinical test of a temporarily incapacitating chemical agent on soldier volunteers.
So the first one I put together was a group of 4 soldiers in a make-believe forward installation post. The doses given to these 4 individuals range from an incapacitating dose at the top down to a mild dose at the bottom.
A low dose of agent was fed into the mixing bowl, and the longest weekend began for Specialist 4th Class Carpenter.
The method given was inhalation. Well, of course, that produced quite a bit of variation. It turned out that by intramuscular injection, you got the same amount of effects, so we used that.
Private Zadrozny received a high dose of the incapacitating agent. In 15 minutes, he won't be able to focus his eyes properly. In an hour, his speech will become difficult. Borderline hallucinations will come late in the experiment.
This individual is a sergeant who received a placebo.
For the 4th volunteer, Sergeant Hall, there would be no effects.
We wanted to have at least one normal individual in there to help out if one of the other guys got really berserk or something.
The peak of the compound's physical effects was reached within 4 to 6 hours. The peak of
About 8 hours is usually the peak time.
several hours later, when a simulated chemical alarm sounded.
Here he's responding to non-existent visual hallucinations. Here he can't get his mask on. He's kind of fighting it with his head because he doesn't know what he's putting on, actually.
Now, soldiers are supposed to mask within 9 seconds. As you can see this guy here, he's not able to mask.
Inability to put on his protective mask demonstrated that the full dose recipient, Zadrozny, was totally ineffective as a team member.
I was lying in a bed because I had just sprained my knee the morning we were supposed to start this thing, playing tennis. And I just simply sat there in bed and watched on closed-circuit TV what was going on in the room.
For Zadrozny, the high-dose subject, the peak of mental incapacitation arrived about 9 hours after exposure to the agent. He remained awake, experiencing hallucinations for a total of 36 hours.
Oh, wait, he was awake and hallucinating for 36 hours?
Yes.
That's horrible.
Miserable.
Hallucinations is a term that's improperly used for LSD, where illusions are the actual experience. And with BZ, they're not illusions, they're actual hallucinations. The individual reacts to them as if they're real.
Constant vigil over the incapacitated man was needed to help control his tendency to panic as his tension and uneasiness mounted.
Ever heard of a drug that makes you hallucinate for 36 hours?
Even some of them would last even longer, for days, almost weeks.
Through the night, Zadrozny searched for an exit.
This happened several times. He'd go over to the door, try to turn the knob, but since it was locked, he couldn't get out. And he said, "We're trapped in here." And he said the same thing numerous times. "We're trapped."
I remember talking on the telephone, and I would get...
After 24 hours rest, the completely recovered volunteers reviewed their experience.
Here they're having a discussion, and I'm sitting here asking them to explain what they did, if they remember it.
What was this business over here in the corner? You were lying down and looking at the wall?
Well, the pores in the wall seem to be, I was looking, and they seem to be two armies on each side of one of the pieces of tape run down the wall, two armies converging. And you guys.
So at the end of these tests, Ketchum would come in and debrief the test subjects. And as you see, this is almost like a group therapy session going through what their experience was.
The medical officer asked for comment from the volunteer who had received a high dose.
Zadrozny, when do you think you would have been able to resume normal function?
I think at about 2 in the morning, 2 o'clock Monday morning.
About 2.5 days.
Yes.
Zadrozny, who had received the heaviest...
He later killed himself a few years after this, I think.
Zadrozny did?
Himself and his wife.
I mean, a lot of the vets that were put through this have had long-standing mental health issues that they attribute to these experiments.
What were you trying to get out for?
I don't know. It just seems that I had to get out.
When it started, there was nobody I could go to talk to about it, because we were told never to mention anything that happened, and I knew exactly where it happened. A lot of the flashbacks that I have, it started right at Edgewood. I have hallucinations almost every night and they're not all the same. Most of the hallucinations I have are so far out, and they're so scary. You know, I have stuff like that's coming after me. I've gotten up, I've ran my head into dressers, I've knocked stuff off shelves. My wife, I chase her out of bed almost every night. You know, and it's not only nighttime. Yeah, you also constantly have those, what I call intrusive thoughts during the daytime. You know, the stuff keeps coming back over and over and over again. That's just been there since Edgewood. And it's gone on for a long, long time.
I honestly think I'm normal. The other med balls, they have serious medical issues. The emphasis should be on them, not me.
We were told it was top secret and couldn't say a word. We were under threat of judicial punishment, okay? And judicial punishment for retaining a top secret clearance is 20 years in Leavenworth. I went home to my fiance, and that was the first time she asked me, "What's wrong with you?" All they could say is, "Yeah, I'm not feeling well. I'll get over it." I didn't. But it's not about me. It's about the people we hurt. And we hurt a lot of people. A lot of people. And if we could have turned back the clock, cut out the top secret banning, I firmly believe that a lot of the people that left all of us would be with us now.
They guaranteed us we were supposed to be called back for checkups for an extended period of time after the test, even up until the time we got out of the military, because they had no idea what the test did to us or what it would do to us, later on down the road. But they never followed up. What was worse than that, we were bound by secrecy oaths. And we were bound not to talk to nobody, including your private doctor, about any of the tests, which limited or restricted us from even filing claims.
Yes.
This letter was sent to everybody in 2006, relieving us from part of that secrecy oath, but on top of that, we were still bound, as this says what you can discuss about the test. They talk about you can discuss about certain things to your doctor, but it says, on the other hand, you should not discuss anything that relates to operational information that might reveal chemical or biological warfare, vulnerabilities, or capabilities. So this right here locks us in still, where we're still bound by the federal government.
What?
Regardless of what they say, we were still bound and we couldn't even file claims. So we've been treated unfairly, all of us have.
To think that you were lured, if you will, into this. And the fact that our own government not only experimented on you, but then did not follow up and did not give you what your just due is it's beyond criminal.
The volunteers found themselves in a classic catch-22. They wanted to file for VA medical benefits, but there was no way to show that their ailments were connected to their service without breaking the oath of secrecy. Breaking that oath would make them ineligible for benefits, because in doing so, they would have been dishonorably discharged. Secrecy oaths aren't unusual in classified military programs, but 50 years seems excessive. Even more, the vets are still partially bound to that secrecy oath today. It begs the question, what is the government still trying to hide about the Edgewood experiments?
A lot of people don't realize after World War II, during the Cold War, we, the Americans and Russians, were fighting to gain some of the smartest people that came out of Germany. That's the way our jet propulsion age came about. That's the way we got ahead in the rocket race. They also brought the doctors that were experimenting on some of the Jewish people there in Auschwitz and different places to Edgewood. And I'm sure that they used them on some of the guys there.
It wasn't just a few of them. There was a lot of them. That's who we were surrounded with. You wouldn't think this country would do that kind of stuff.
A lot of people probably will say that's all just a bunch of bull, but it's not. If you look up Project Paperclip, that's the way it was orchestrated.
In 1945, President Truman receives a memo from the Commerce Secretary, which essentially says that the United States will be bringing outstanding German scientists to, quote, advance the frontiers of scientific knowledge for national benefit. And what this was Project Paperclip. Between 1945 and 1959, the United States brought in untold numbers of scientists from Germany, many of them Nazis.
Wait, so this was after the Nuremberg trials?
Right, and in fact, some of the scientists went through Nuremberg and were released early to come to the United States.
I mean, it's sickening. I have a memorandum here where they're referring to Nazi war criminals as German talent.
They gave these people visas. And I've read that at least 8 Nazi scientists were at Edgewood, and 2 of them were Otto Ambros and Fritz Hoffmann. These were 2 of Hitler's favorite chemists in Nazi Germany.
I mean, Ambros was literally on trial in Nuremberg.
I mean, just like stepping back for a second, we take Nazi scientists and we bring them to our top arsenal for chemicals, where we are testing our own servicemen. I mean, just think about that for a second. That's not chilling. I mean, this is like, do we have any documents from Edgewood that show Ambros was a chemist there?
Yeah, there's documentation that both Ambros and Hoffmann were there, but it's a little bit unclear exactly if they were involved with Ketchum's work. We do know that Hoffmann did take an interest in LSD, so the idea that they collaborated in some way isn't too far out.
Sometimes mentioned that we brought over Nazi chemists to work in our labs. They were no real Nazis. I mean, they had to do what they were told back in Europe. Although there were a couple people that were in the chemical branch of my larger clinical research department that took place in these other buildings.
To me, Dr. Ketchum's statement that there were no real Nazis is disturbing. Although we can't prove or disprove the vet's claims of Nazi involvement in the psychochemical program, if you volunteered for the Edgewood assignment, you could find yourself in an actual gas chamber.
There were many other non-lethal agents that were developed and tested at Edgewood. They went way beyond psychochemicals. I think they really just cast a wide net in order to see what could perhaps give an edge on the battlefield.
I mean, it says here CS gas. Is that the same as the police use?
Yeah, but then with the Vietnam War, they had the idea to use this in combat.
This is a report on chemical munition systems currently under development by the United States Army.
So they had a project called Water Bucket to make riot control agents into tactical weapons. They tested it at Fort Campbell, American soldiers pretending that they were Viet Cong.
The objective of the test was to determine the effects of Agent CS on both masked and unmasked troops.
If you look at the Vietnam War, we had 2 things we used. We used herbicides and riot control agents on the battlefield. Riot control to get rid of cover, and herbicides to get rid of concealment. And that's the purpose of these kind of tests, was to show that this stuff is effective and make those weapons.
Troop Test Water Bucket 1 indicated that riot control agent CS was a potentially effective tactical weapon that could be employed both offensively and defensively. In December 1965, Troop Test Water Bucket 2 was conducted at Edgewood Arsenal, Maryland, to test the effectiveness in a series of simulated tactical situations.
At Edgewood, they're trying to test how much CS tear gas will produce a casualty effect on the battlefield. And so the levels that they would do there would be much higher than they would do for training purposes.
In this plant is a compound called CS, and it has a swift and pronounced effect on men. So much so that the United States Army Chemical Warfare Laboratories are investigating between the effective dose and the lethal dose.
We found in none that the CS they were using wasn't as potent as they thought it was. So when they said they were going to strengthen it, so we signed off on a dotted line, you know, good old soldiers as we were. We signed off, and then they started testing it.
What you are about to see are actual film clips of those tests.
They would never tell you what they were testing. It was just another gas. That was one of the 2 worst tests I ever took.
Criteria for the study were based upon experiments then being conducted in a dynamic aerosol exposure chamber to study effects of proposed compounds. These Army volunteers who entered the chamber knowing they would be subjected to an aerosol of a new compound, but not knowing what the effects would be.
This is really disturbing. This is a gas chamber. This does not look any different than what you would see in a concentration camp.
They want to make sure that if they're going to use it on the battlefield, they will stop a highly motivated enemy that wants to kill you.
I remember being in it, and I was probably in maybe a minute and a half.
The effects were apparent almost at once. Although told to remain in the chamber as long as they could, in just 27 seconds, the volunteers left the chamber.
First thing I did was wipe my eyes, and I went blind. Like, I totally blind for about 8 hours.
I passed out. I mean, I was out of it. And I mean, I was out of it to the point where I was in the barracks for 4 days. I have brain damage because of this. I have sight in only one eye. This all happened after Edgewood. Am I angry? I'm angry, but not to the point where I want revenge. I want justice, okay? We want medical treatment, and we want it to be out in the open so it never happens again.
Though the Army experimented with an array of non-lethal chemicals, BZ proved to be the most promising incapacitating agent. But before weaponizing it, military brass needed to see how it would perform outside of a clinical setting, in open battlefield conditions. So, Ketchum devised a large-scale test at a military site in the remote desert of Utah called Dugway Proving Ground.
To get this idea off, they need to experiment with BZ out at Dugway to see how it would really work in that scenario. A lot of the experiments you had seen here, they were dosed by injection or other means. This was one where it was battlefield open air experiment, not in a test chamber. Ketchum put this idea together, and he got approval for it.
Ketchum spent more than 10 years and millions of dollars on the human testing of BZ. But the program's funding was drying up. He needed to wow his military superiors and prove to them once and for all that BZ was ready to be weaponized.
So I wrote a plot for this movie in which it started out with the cloud going down through the night sky.
This is the cloud that causes confusion. This cloud was unleashed so men could measure the dimensions of its stupefying power.
What they did is they put the test subjects on a flatbed truck and they moved them around inside the smoke at 100 and 1,000 yards downwind.
The truck itself was moving up and backward along this arc of the circle to follow, you know, the smoke that was coming rather than have it go off to the side and miss the volunteers.
By helicopter, The exposed volunteers were brought from the test grid to the medical unit to be watched and studied. Each hour contained an examination by the doctor.
How's your eye? 693, 86.
We had 8 different tasks that were all set up. They even put up a forest for us in this desert-type area where the testing was done.
Here we are 1 hour later. That would be 5 hours.
And they had to carry out duties as a patrol against an opposing patrol that had no drug.
Could we see an example of something you would call military incapacitation?
Well, perhaps a good illustration would be Private Green.
Sergeant, there were 6 enemy soldiers coming this way, then they went back. Sergeant, there, guard.
We got a helicopter approaching dead center. It turns out to be a private plane.
So through the experiment, they would put them out and have them do mock combat exercises.
You have an ID card, Sergeant.
Doing things to see how they would operate, being instructed to take orders. As you can see, this guy here can barely walk, and he's having to be guided to his guard post.
That's good. Sergeant, the guard.
Sergeant, the guard.
And then they would be sent back to the clinical testing area where the indoor testing was done. And all of this was videotaped.
He seems to be having some trouble.
Yes, he certainly is. There are several scenes here which show typical signs of early delirium, compatible with what we call a toxic brain syndrome.
Can't what? Talk. Can't make the words come out? Is your throat have anything to do with that?
I feel like what the videos really drive home, too, is how young all of them were. Like, this was happening so early in their lives.
Oh, this guy's terrified.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's crying.
Now, this was how many hours after being gassed?
3 hours.
Was he out of commission after that?
He sure was.
Well, what about those other tests he was doing inside, the pencil test?
This was a lengthy experiment. It was easily a week-long exercise.
And so the film that Ketchum produced, did that convince the generals that this was worth moving forward?
Yeah, BZ was standardized as a chemical weapon. The United States acquired 100,000 pounds of it, and we weaponized it into a series of thermal munitions.
Was it ever used in battle?
It was never used in battle that we know of.
Ketchum finally completed his mission to weaponize an incapacitating agent. But soon after, Edgewood's secret human research program was exposed.
The U.S. Army today suspended testing chemical compounds on human volunteers at its Edgewood arsenal in Maryland.
By 1975, word got out about what was going on at Edgewood, and the program was quickly engulfed in scandal. Stories of medical misconduct leaked out of the facility, as well as the Army's lack of follow-up treatment for the volunteers.
I tried to get a follow-up study done. And my boss said, no, we can't afford to do that. I said, well, can we do some of it? And finally said, okay, 50 guys who got different drugs. So we didn't get enough guys in one drug category to draw any conclusions. All he could say is that none of the 50 showed anything to worry about. But I couldn't get, a full-scale follow-up.
Okay, so here's a memo from the Department of Army saying that it's initiated a program to identify and notify participants, and this was from November 2nd, 1979. So was that the first time that they reached out to these test vets to say, hey, there may have been long-term effects of that testing?
The problem with that study was that it was not able to contact all of the 6,500 people that were subjected to experiments at Edgewood.
Why not?
Just because they didn't have contact information for people after they had left the service.
I don't think the Army contacted any of them. They had
no intentions of doing any long-term studies to see what harm it did. They never had any intentions.
No, the military had already decided not to approve any further testing and to disapprove any further use of BZ or stockpiling. And they also started tucking all the reports in that period into file drawers in some locked up place. They completely shoveled it under the rug.
The Army's decision not to follow up on the test subjects raises questions. Was it that they were afraid of what they might discover? Or was there an alternative motive? The test vets began digging for answers.
Frank, what have you got there?
When I was discharged, it says here that I would be called back for later tests in 2 weeks. No, this one says follow-up, 7 days. 7 days I was supposed to have been called back.
Did you ever get a call?
No. Haven't heard from them yet. I'm still waiting.
How many years has it been?
I'm standing by the phone.
Okay,
Good.
yeah.
Yeah, we can laugh now, can't we, Dave?
That's what I used to say. They're coming.
It is comical.
Yeah.
In 2011, some of the volunteers began requesting documents from the Army to find out the details of the experiments they were in. But the documents they received posed more questions than answers.
When I decided to try to get my records, I heard it was hard to get them. So I sent 2 requests on the same day, certified. And 2 weeks later, I got both of them back. One was fairly redacted, and the other was semi-clean.
Why do you think they redacted it?
They were hiding stuff. Here's the consent form. There's 3 of them. One of them was dated the 27th of April, 1969. I got out of the Army in 67, and I was at Edgewood in 65. This is May of 64. May of 64, I was in high school.
So they're saying that that's a release form.
Yeah.
That you've...
Well, what they obviously had done is cut the bottom off or something.
So here's your name, signed and dated.
Right.
For dates that you were not...
In the Army.
It's absurd.
It looks like they ripped them off the bottom, pasted them all up, and copied them all together.
And it says the nature of the proposed experimental procedure has been personally explained to the undersigned volunteer, and he agrees to participate as a volunteer.
Right.
And you weren't in the Army.
No.
So these are made up.
Right.
It's a government document. And this is a medical document on top of all of it.
Right.
This is crazy.
If it's true that the Army fabricated consent forms, what else are they trying to hide from the volunteers?
Yeah, what else do you have, guys?
Well, we'll start with my records. I did get a complete set of records. Later on, I was told, that probably is not all your records, so you need to go back and ask again, which I did. And when I did get another complete set of records, but there were a couple of documents that were included in that was not included in the very first one. I got a sheet that documented each drug that I had taken and the date. There was 3 different...
You didn't get that the first time around?
No, I didn't get that one sheet.
Why wouldn't they give that to you? That seems pretty relevant to
your... It included another test, which was not in the first batch.
Frank has a theory on why one test may have been excluded from his original records. And I've got to warn you, it's pretty wild. It involves another top-secret program run by the CIA.
I remember nothing about the test. Just that I had EA2233 on such and such date. Well, I don't remember that. EA2233, which reading about it is one of the highest hallucinogenic drugs that you can take. It's like BZ. But that's also a drug that wipes your memory out. You can't remember what happened. A lot of people don't know the CIA was involved. They were actually used to help experiment on us, trying to brainwash people, which the CIA was interested in. And I'm not going to elaborate on what happened that I think was related to that, because it's embarrassing to me. But there was a little bar, if I'm not mistaken, off post, right out the gate. And then I think that they, without me knowing it, laced something that I'd drunk. And they did this to people. And back in the 50s, they had a project called Project Midnight Climax. The CIA in California took hookers, and this is the truth, and they paid them to lace their John's drinks with LSD and making people do things that they wouldn't normally do. I'm thinking that this is part of that same program, because what happened at this bar, me and two of my friends met this lady who I thought, she said she was a BAM or a woman army. What happened is beyond what an old country boy from North Carolina would have been involved in. So the CIA was involved deeply in this, regardless of what they say. This ain't fake news, this is the truth.
Frank's claim may seem like a wild conspiracy theory, but the CIA was in fact experimenting with drugs on unsuspecting Americans at the exact same time. By the 1950s, medical researchers at universities across America became interested in LSD for its possible therapeutic application in psychiatric disorders like addiction and depression. But what many of them didn't know is that much of that research was secretly being funded by the Central Intelligence Agency under a program called MK-Ultra. The CIA wanted to find out if they could use LSD on foreign adversaries as a truth serum or a mind control agent.
I'm going to give you this cup that contains lysergic acid. Will you drink it? Yes.
MK-Ultra contracted with psychiatrists to do work, universities, prisons. Would work with LSD. They would work with materials that would cause amnesia. Narcotics were involved. They ran the gamut. For example, a lot of the LSD work was done at brothels in like San Francisco with foreign national businessmen visiting them.
What was the name of that project?
Operation Midnight Climax. Basically to lure men and to dose them unknowingly with LSD.
Even to this day, it's a blemish on the CIA's record as a seriously ethically challenged program.
And Sidney Gottlieb was the man who was running MK-Ultra, and he had Alan Dulles, who was then the CIA chief, really supporting him, and there was very little accountability. In one of the documents, Gottlieb basically states the mission of MK-Ultra as to crush the human psyche. I mean, just really dark, deranged stuff.
I mean, I think it says a lot that with Ketchum and Edgewood, he kept all the documentation of the experiments that they conducted, whereas Sidney Gottlieb, at the end of MK-Ultra, he ordered everyone to destroy all records of it completely.
But MK-Ultra, there was no crossover with Edgewood, right?
Edgewood did its own thing, and the CIA was doing separate stuff, but they were all researching psychochemicals for their own purposes.
The United States was conducting 2 top-secret drug programs at the same time. It's difficult to imagine that there was no crossover between the two. We've established that the Army's volunteer program may have been conducting experiments unethically. But if the CIA was using enlisted soldiers as human guinea pigs without their consent, it wouldn't only be immoral, it would be illegal.
That's the one I want. I want that one.
Because the Ferris Doctrine prohibits soldiers from taking any kind of legal action against the military, the test vets needed to prove that the CIA was involved. It was the only way they could make a case against the Army for denying their VA medical claims. That proof would come from a fellow Edgewood vet, Eric Muth.
I think what they did is went out of their way to eliminate the paper trail.
Eric spent more than a decade filing Freedom of Information requests, and as a result, he collected a trove of top-secret documents. One of those documents alluded to a money trail between the CIA and Edgewood.
$37,000 to Earl, Edgewood Arsenal. This was about human subjects just being deployed to classified secret. What was it all about?
Though it's unclear what the money transfer was for, it allowed the vets to circumvent the Ferris Doctrine and file a civil case naming the CIA as a defendant, with the Department of Defense and VA as co-defendants.
Good morning. Here marks the beginning of the deposition for Dr. James S. Ketchum, Volume 1, in the matter of Vietnam veteran.
In 2011, Dr. James Ketchum was deposed by the vet's lawyers. That deposition has never been shared publicly, until now.
You realize you're testifying under penalty of perjury as if you were testifying in a court of law.
Yes.
As head of research at Edgewood, Ketchum would certainly have known if the CIA was experimenting on American soldiers. The question was, how much did he know, and what was his own involvement with the intelligence agency?
You're not an employee of the CIA, are you?
No.
Were you ever an employee of the CIA?
No.
You're not currently an independent contractor with the CIA?
No.
Were you ever an independent contractor with the CIA?
No.
So this deposition of James Ketchum contains a lot of really fascinating information. 2 days of deposition, Ketchum being asked really about Edgewood, about potential CIA involvement, a lot of the agents that were being used at Edgewood then too.
Were you aware that the CIA had transferred funds to Earl for the purpose of carrying out studies involving EA 3167?
No, I was not aware of that.
There's a document here that says funds in the amount of $37,000 were transferred to Edgewood Arsenal for the purpose of determining the clinical effects of EA 3167.
EA 3167, that is a long-lasting psychochemical like BZ.
But it's different?
It's different. It could penetrate through the skin.
You ever hear of a plan to apply EA through 3167 through a handshake?
None that I recall.
Now, that would be valuable to the CIA, because you can take out a political opponent by making it look like they are suffering from chronic alcoholism or schizophrenia, and then they could be taken out of action by having a long-term mental defect from these chemicals.
The agency set up a joint effort with Edgewood to pursue further animal testing and to move to human testing on this compound. Military and volunteers in the Edgewood program were tested with symptoms lasting up to 6 weeks. Were you involved in any of that work?
I wrote the summary report. The subjects tested at Edgewood Arsenal may have been tested by someone under my supervision.
I think it's a matter of what did he know and what did he not want to know.
Yeah, but that doesn't necessarily mean Ketchum knew. There is the possibility he would not know who was funding his work.
This project was a part of the project designated as MK Often. Do you know who the CIA contact officer was for the EA 3167 project?
I didn't know there was one.
I mean, in terms of him being dodgy, the lawyer flat out asks him, my question was, did you understand that the Project Often was a joint testing program between Edgewood Arsenal and the CIA? And Ketchum replies,
as I stated, I didn't know of any programs or sub-programs of MK Ultra while I was at Edgewood. In fact, this term would have been very strange to me.
Okay, this is not MK Ultra, this is Project Often.
Oh, okay, well.
That sort of implies that he knew something about MK Ultra, because there's another document here saying there are 149 MK Ultra sub-projects.
The problem we have is Sidney Gottlieb destroyed the record, so we don't know what happened back then or how much involvement there was with Edgewood.
There is a quote here in the deposition where they ask,
You don't condone that, do you?
Destruction of records?
Yes.
Not generally.
He's keeping the door open to maybe in some cases the destruction of records is beneficial to me, my legacy, to the program, to the government.
Dr. Ketchum tried to keep as many records as possible. And one of the things that's interesting is because he was a medical doctor, he had to keep personal records of these things as well. It's a gray area. Are these test subjects or are they patients?
Here marks the end. Videotape number 3 is Dr. James.
Lawyers for the test vets laid out undeniable proof of CIA involvement at Edgewood. But because Ketchum was a psychiatrist and the test subjects were under his care, doctor-patient confidentiality forbade him from disclosing medical information to any outside parties, even the court of law.
That's okay. In fact, I was asked during my deposition, how did you get those reports out of Edgewood Arsenal? And I said, in boxes. Next question.
Ketchum's personal records and medical reports of the Army psychochemical program may have revealed a deeper connection between the CIA and Edgewood. But after the program shut down, Ketchum held on to those documents.
If you knew those reports existed today and you asked for them, you probably wouldn't be able to get most of them. The government would just say that's restricted or it doesn't exist. Some individuals 20 years later told me when I went there, we were told there were no tests done. Officers told me, there were no tests done here with drugs. It's like it never happened.
In 2017, the civil case was settled. The court mandated the Department of Defense to inform all volunteers who participated in the program that they are now eligible for full VA medical benefits. But once again, they trusted the Army to actually contact the test vets.
When we won the case in 2017, I said, man, we beat them. We beat them. But it's a very shallow victory when the government don't follow through and do what they were ordered to do. Then what recourse? Where are you going to go? I don't feel like they tried to contact the people. To what extent did they try to reach out to all the vets that went through Edgewood? I don't think they have. When they've got only 80 or 90 people that has actually gotten health care out of 7,200 and some that went through it. So where do you turn to?
After everything we learned about Edgewood, what concerns me most is that we come up with these rules, codes, laws, just to make sure we don't repeat our darkest chapters of history. And then we find a reason to break them, to inflict harm in the name of national security. How long until we cross that line again, to justify dangerous experiments, just to get ahead of our enemies? I hope the story of Edgewood teaches us that it's never worth it.
If you had 3 wishes, you could wish for anything you wanted, what would your 3 wishes be?
My number 1, I wish that the world would stop acting like kids and act like grown people.
While I was in the 4th grade, I was asked to write an essay on my life,
When LSD is given to
plans and ambitions. And I said, I want to become a scientist and help a struggling humanity.
After a long period of sleep, which
Look, I've got regrets about a number of things I've done. That would not apply to the work I did at Edgewood. I thought I did a pretty good job with that.